So now I invite our next speaker, who is Mr. Marek Matraszek. And now I should add one more sentence. If you was growing up in Hungary, then Marek Matraszek's name is very familiar from Kodály choirs, Mátrai képek, and from many folk songs. Matraszék is a very popular places in the Hungarian folk songs. And I was always wrong pronouncing his name only in the Hungarian version, Matraszék, which is now I can realize that it was wrong. So now I pronounce maybe the first time in my life that in the Polish version. So let's listen to Mr. Marek Matraszek.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's both a delight and a daunting experience to be in this room, because there are so many friends here, and I feel that in many ways we are all part of Roger's family, because our experiences that brought us together were very much a result of Roger's tutelage, friendship and love. So there are a lot of common experiences here and common relationships. But it's also very daunting, because I recognize what I'm going to be saying is going to be very precisely dissected by people who actually knew and loved Roger as much as I did. And it's actually, I find it rather amusing, because actually what I'm going to be saying is pretty much what Sophie and Roger have already said, which is actually in a way it's testament to how common our interpretations and understandings of Roger are. And it's actually very warming to see that there is this growing consensus about what Roger's impact on Central Europe was, and how it came to affect so many of us in very similar ways. So there is now a common foundation, and I think that's a very strong position to be in, that certainty about what Roger brought to the region. Now, again, I have to thank the organisers of this event, because I think the way it's been structured is excellent. And I will try in this short period to say a few words to bring a little bit closer the Polish aspect of Roger, which was a very important part of his life. It certainly impacted me in a very significant way, because after I met Roger in 1984, the trajectory of my life changed in a huge way. But nonetheless, I think Poland played a very important role in Roger's life. I mean, Roger was remarkable because he had this incredible ability to focus on so many aspects of the world and of thought. And he had a huge history in Hungary. He had obviously a massive relationship in the then Czechoslovakia. But Poland was a very important part of his experience, and Poland in itself, as I will come to say in the end, recognized this very, very deeply in terms of the way in which the political establishment prior to Roger's passing came to recognize the impact that he had on that country. So I'll start off by just basically saying that Roger's affection for Poland was also a function of the way in which Central Europe itself played a role in his life, and his affection for Poland has to be seen in the context of his broader relationship to Central Europe, and why he was drawn to this region in the first place. I think both Sophie and Zsolt have mentioned 1968. In fact, there's a passage in one of his writings where he actually says this was the cathartic moment of his intellectual path, was the experience of 1968, when he was in Paris at the time. And there's a little vignette of him watching the riots, the social disruption of the student revolt in 1968 in Paris, and saying, this is what I am against. I am against destruction. I am in favor of protection, recovery, creation. I'm not in favor of destruction and vilification of the past. And this recognition that there was something very valuable in civilization that had to be protected came to him at that moment. And he found this essence of civilization, paradoxically, to be found in Eastern Europe, as it then was, because that was the area of Europe where, despite communism, the values that he cherished, national identity, a sense of the divine, either through religion or through other means, national identity, cultural identity. This had all paradoxically, despite the artificial imposition of communist or Soviet occupation, had thrived and continued to thrive in this part of the world. So he definitely saw Central Europe as a continuing depository of civilizational values, which was so much under threat, not just by Soviet communism, but also by the massed forces of the revolutionary left in Western Europe. So there was this understanding of the civilizational importance of Central Europe. But there was also, I think, a very personal journey that Roger went through in the United Kingdom, which was related to academic freedom. And those of you who know Roger's academic biography, as it were, he had academic ambitions. He wanted to be well respected within the British academic community. And throughout the 1980s, he was increasingly alienated within the British academic community, precisely because of his writings through the work of the Salisbury Review and his experiences at Birkbeck College, where he was a lecturer and a professor of philosophy, became increasingly difficult for him. And this was the paradox that when he came to Central Europe, he found that this was the area where he could actually paradoxically speak more freely. He found an intellectual community here. He found friendships. He found, even though his relationships had to be conducted in underground seminars, in secret meeting places, he felt the intellectual affinities here much more stronger than he found them to be in the United Kingdom. And the friendships that he formed in Poland were especially grounded in this community of philosophical partners and friendships. And the relationships that he formed in Poland in the 1980s with well-known at that point academics such as Zdzisław Krasnodębski, Ryszard Legutko, the late Miłowit Kuniński, the late Marcin Król. These were all intellectual friends who, together with Roger, recognized that it was actually their pursuit of intellectual truth was something that could be pursued much more safely in the framework of friendship that they found together in their seminars. But there was a final aspect of Central Europe that attracted him, which was the philosophical tradition of Central Europe. Roger Scruton obviously was a British philosopher. He was founded, he is seen today as Douglas Murray recognizes, and as Jolt mentioned, as a true titan of conservative thought, and he is seen as being part of the grand triad of British conservative thinkers, going back to Burke and through Oakeshott and Scruton. I think today we can say this is the great trilogy of British conservative thinkers. But there was an aspect of British philosophy which Roger felt less comfortable with, and that was, of course, the analytical tradition. And paradoxically, he found himself, despite living in the United Kingdom, attracted to continental philosophy. And without going into too much philosophical detail, because I know Professor Jorge here is much more adept, and hopefully he will mention a few things as well in this regard. But throughout Roger's writings, you see much more of Kant, you see much more of Hegel, of Wittgenstein, Patočka's been mentioned, going back through back from Patočka through Husserl. And so Roger actually found many of his sort of intellectual stimuli being much more rooted in continental philosophy than British philosophy. And of course, those masters of philosophy, if you think of them geographically, you think of Kant in Königsberg, Hegel. There's a geographical pattern here, going from Königsberg down to Vienna, and so it's unsurprising that this part of Central Europe is something that attracted Roger intellectually as well as politically. And in Poland, of course, he was particularly drawn to the writings of the then Karol Wojtyła, later to become John Paul II. And one of his great intellectual friendships in Poland at the time was with Józef Tischner, Father Józef Tischner, who was the late Father Tischner, who was a great Catholic intellectual and philosopher. And his relationship with Tischner and his understanding of post-war Polish philosophy, I've also mentioned Ryszard Legutko, was something that he felt, again, very much at home with. So he was drawn to Poland through a combination of his experiences in England, his relationship with philosophical thought, and his recognition that Central Europe as a whole contains something which he felt both to be of value in itself and to be a sort of a beacon, if you like, for intellectual and political work in Western Europe. So that's the broad background, which is his love and affection for Central Europe and why he particularly found himself attracted to this part of the world. And so his trips to Central Europe, when they began, I think the first trip was to the then Czechoslovakia in the very late 1970s. But he started to travel to Poland in the early 1980s. He was drawn to Poland I think his first visit was in either 1982 or 1983, just after martial law had been declared in Poland. So it was a particularly difficult time to be traveling. And obviously the work that he started to do in Poland had to be done under the cover, as it were, of more cultural discussions. He had struck up in the early 1980s a friendship with Krzysztof Michalski, who many of you will know, who in the early 1980s in Vienna had founded the Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen. This was an institution that had been actually established with the encouragement of John Paul II and with the support of Erhard Busek, who at that time was the mayor of Vienna, and was created as a way of creating a platform in which philosophers and thinkers from both communist Central Europe and Western Europe could meet and discuss. And Krzysztof Michalski in 1983 in Poland organized an initial conference on the work of the Polish composer Karol Szymanowski. And Roger's first trip, I think, to Poland was in 1983 for that conference. And he started to travel more and more. He started to make these initial intellectual friendships with the individuals that I've mentioned, Legutko and Krasnodębski in particular. And he, at the same time, created in the United Kingdom an institution which was modeled on the earlier, and I'm sure we'll hear about it in the Czech context, of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation. He created an institution called the Jagellonian Trust, which was a charity which was registered in the United Kingdom, on the board of which was himself. There were a number of other people whose names would be very familiar to you. The daughter of Professor Leszek Kołakowski, Agnieszka Kołakowska, Jessica Douglas-Hume, Baroness Caroline Cox, Timothy Garton-Ash, Dennis O'Keefe, and others. And the role of the Jagellonian Trust, which was established, I think, in 1982 or 1983, was to create a legal vehicle for the dissemination of books and literature, and as a platform through which academic visits could be organized to Poland through the aegis, under the aegis of the Trust. And from about 1983, 1984 onwards, the Jagellonian Trust played a very important role in sending British academics and philosophers and other academic luminaries to Poland to start lecturing and meeting Polish intellectuals and communities. It developed relatively quickly into a much broader enterprise of support for underground political groups in Poland. After martial law, despite the strictures of martial law, from about 1983, 1984, there was a huge flourishing of underground political groups in Poland. And if you went through all the major cities of Poland, not just Warsaw, but Łódź, Gdańsk, Wrocław, Poznań, Kraków, of course, in each of these cities you would find a huge network of political activists publishing books in the underground, organizing seminars. There's a real flourishing of the independent anti-communist dissident network that started to develop in Poland. And after 1985, 1986, when the strictures of martial law started to be lifted by the communist regime, which was already substantially weakening at that time with the development of Gorbachev in the East, there was a true flourishing of the independent political conservative network in Poland. And one of the tasks of the Jagellonian Trust was to identify those political groups that had started to develop and to start to work with them, not just through an academic lens, but through a much more overt political lens. And from about 1984, 1985 onwards, the Jagellonian Trust established a very sophisticated network of couriers and other individuals who would travel regularly into Poland, carrying not just books, but also printing equipment, photocopiers, which at that point were a huge technological innovation. And we discovered that you could fit a photocopier into a suitcase. And so we had a whole series of couriers taking photocopiers into Poland through customs at Warsaw Airport, and there was a special course that we had to go through of how to avoid being searched by communist customs at Warsaw Airport, and so on. So it was an exciting time, and the network that developed as a result of this activity really came to flourish after 1989-90, where many of the conservative individuals that we had worked with suddenly came into political prominence. And it was very satisfying to see, for Roger especially, to see that his work that he had done during this period of the 1980s flourishing to such an extent. One of his most favorite destinations in Poland in the 1980s was Przemyśl, the town many of you will know, abutting today the Ukrainian border. And it was a town that he felt a special affection to, mainly through the friendships that he formed through there, particularly with Marek Kuchcinski, who at the time was running a very small academic discussion group in the attic of a farmhouse outside Przemyśl, so attic meaning strych in Polish, and publishing a journal called The Cultural Attic, Strych Kulturalny. And Roger particularly fell in love with Przemyśl because in a way it was a town which encapsulated everything that he felt to be important in Central Europe: the cultural affinity, the architectural affinity, and above all the fact that Przemyśl, because of its peculiar history and geographical location, represented the best of Galician political and cultural traditions. And he felt that this was a town that in a way embodied the spirit of Central Europe in many ways. And he grew to love that town greatly and he returned to that town even later in his life. And one of the key friendships, of course, was through Marek Kuchcinski, who, interestingly enough, forms two parts of the arc of Roger's relationship with Poland. When I first met Roger, it was in 1984 at the Catholic University of Lublin. And when I met him, the very first thing that he said was, do you know any anti-communists in this city? He had no other interest in anything else. I said, I do know a few anti-communists. And one of the few individuals that I introduced him to was the then very young Marek Kuchcinski, who then took him to Przemyśl. And it was very fitting that on Roger's last visit to Poland, which Zsolt was also present at in 2019 in the Polish Parliament at the great conference on the 30th anniversary of the fall of communism. His host was the Speaker of Polish Parliament, Marek Kuchcinski, who hosted him this time in a very different role as the Speaker of the Parliament in 2019. So there was this arc of Roger's relationship with Poland, very much framed by his friendship with Marek Kuchcinski. So Roger's activities in Poland during the communist period were very much, as I say, both driven by his own intellectual interests, but also, I think, out of all the countries that he was active in Central Europe, it was the most political relationship that he had under communism. For different reasons, Czechoslovakia and Hungary and the groups that he met here were much more cultural and philosophical and academic, but his political aspect of Roger's identity, I think, was best seen through his activities in Poland. Now, as Zsolt also said, the 1989 marked a great turn, not only in the history of Central Europe, of course, but also in Roger's work. And it's very interesting to hear what Zsolt was saying, because it was very similar to what I experienced with Roger as well after 1989. And his work, the nature of his work, shifted substantially after the turn of communism. In the very final works that Roger wrote in 2019, just before his death, one of his final works was the libretto to his final opera, Anna, which Sophie mentioned. And that work actually, in a way, is very worth studying because as an opera, because it reflects many of Roger's experiences and thoughts about the dilemmas, the moral dilemmas that we all were faced with after 1989. And the recognition that after the fall of communism, after the falling away, as it were, of communist autocracy and Soviet occupation, Central Europe faced something that many would say was akin to a political and moral and cultural vacuum. And it was very, and the opera is really about, it's a sad piece because it talks about the way in which the grand hopes of moral renewal and cultural recovery and religious reflourishing very quickly became challenged by the inevitable arrival of Western liberalism and liberal thinking, and how Central Europe started to struggle between, on the one hand, wanting to preserve its national identity, its cultural sentiments, its moral precepts, its religious beliefs, once faced with this new political and cultural environment where very slowly but surely the influence of some Western liberal traditions led to a slow erosion of these values, and the struggles that everyone had to face throughout the 1990s and the 2000s about how to respond to this. Part of the response, and Zsolt again mentioned this, was Roger's role as the godfather, as it were, of the creation of the Windsor Group, which existed not just in Hungary in the form of the Windsor Club, but also in Poland with the Windsor Group, and also there were 2 other chapters, as it were, in the then now Czech Republic and Slovakia. And these 4 Windsor groups, these Windsor clubs, were very much Roger's initiative, and we were very privileged to be involved in this work. Zsolt has mentioned Jonathan Sundby, who did fantastic work here in Hungary, and I was privileged to be chairing the Windsor group in Poland. And we were very much involved in this debate about the cultural struggle, as it were, of the new post-89 environment. On the one hand, talking about the need for Western Europe, Central Europe to be brought into Western institutions, particularly NATO, as quickly as possible. We recently celebrated, or are celebrating, the 75th anniversary of the establishment of NATO. And I remember in 1999 a wonderful ceremony in Brussels after the accession of Hungary, Poland and the Czech Republic to NATO in 1999, where Viktor Orban and the leaders of Poland and the Czech Republic came together to celebrate the accession of Poland and those 3 countries into NATO. And Viktor Orban recognized the work of the Hungarian Windsor Club very significantly by inviting Jonathan Sundby and myself as well to be part of the official Hungarian delegation. So in a way, we were, through Roger's spirit, we were involved in many aspects of the reintegration of Central Europe into the West. But Roger was very concerned, especially about this other challenge that had started to emerge in the 2000s, about how to react to and how to preserve what he found to be inspiring in Central Europe all those years ago, back in the 1960s and 1970s. The language, the customs, the religions, the national sentiments of this region. And I think the fact that in the last year of his life, he was rewarded by the elites of Central Europe in a very public fashion, initially in Poland by President Duda, who awarded him the Great Cross of the Order of Merit, which was and is Poland's highest order that can be awarded to a foreign national. He received a similar order from in the Czech Republic, and it was concluded by the order that he was granted by the Hungarian state accorded to Roger in November 2019, just before his passing. And this was actually, in a way, a recognition by the political elites of Poland, Czech and Hungary of the importance that he had played, not just in the activities, the intellectual and political activities leading to the fall of communism in 1989, but also the very important work that he had done after 1989 to preserve the values that he found the most important. And I will close by just reading to you a little quote that was given by President Andrzej Duda, the President of Poland, actually in the award that he received, and Zsolt mentioned this in 2016, at the Congress of Poland, the Great Project, the Lech Kaczynski Award. And he, when granting Roger this award, this is 2016, by the way, the President of Poland made a very similar speech when he gave Roger the Grand Order of Merit in 2019. But President Duda in 2016 at the ceremony stated the following: "I also wish to express my gratitude," this is President Duda speaking, "I wish to express my gratitude to the Congress for conferring the Courage and Credibility Award on Professor Sir Roger Scruton. Sir Roger is not just a knight of the realm in the United Kingdom, but one of the greatest contemporary thinkers and philosophers. Wasn't his 1979 essay, What is Conservatism?, that gave rise to the modern British conservative thought and most certainly effective conservative political ideas the world over? It was there that we encountered a simple but most perfect essence of that thought, namely that the state should not push people into an ideology, but that it should offer them an idea, a living idea stemming organically from their culture and tradition, an idea that is understood instinctively as a common good. To understand it is to know that a country is for the people and not just for the elites. And I think it's particularly impressive that it had to be a Polish head of state in 2016 to say so clearly and succinctly why Roger was important both to Poland, to intellectual thought in Europe, and to as a defender of very fundamental values. And I think, as Zsolt mentioned, it's a contrast between the way in which Roger was treated by the elites of Central Europe with the way he was treated by the elites of the United Kingdom, many of which at the crucial time of trial betrayed Roger through their cowardice and the way in which they refused or backed away or surrendered to the attack that occurred in the final year of his life. And I think in a way this is a testament to Roger's initial instinct all those years ago in 1968 and the early 1970s, that it was in Central Europe and in Poland especially that he found himself to be truly at home, and it was a home which loved him very dearly. Thank you very much.